A lot of the time, anime and games like to incorporate these ideas and these events from Western religion, specifically Christianity, as an inspiration or as components for their themes or their plots, right? And it's not super hard to see why. Like, if you were to strip away all of the zealotry, all of the fanatical devotion, all of the proselytizing from modern Christianity, and just look at the Bible as a purely, mythological text, it's actually quite interesting, right? Like, there is some wild stuff that happens in the Bible. Like, we are talking about the book where a man is attacked by an army. He takes up a donkey's jawbone and beats the army to death with it, right? And then right afterwards, he says, "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have slain 1,000 men." All right. That is the most anime protagonist JRPG thing that I have ever heard of. It's fantastic. So yeah, it's not too surprising to see why, stories like to take these components, and, mold them to fit their narrative or to take these ideas and kind of echo them. And Reverse 1999 does that as well. There's quite a lot of, religious subtext, a lot of themes to do with religion and saviors and what have you, and, good versus evil, that sort of thing. And today we're just going to go ahead and take a look at some of those that we have seen so far. So yeah, let's go ahead and take a look. So to start with, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the more general allusions in the game. These aren't going to be things that will typically tie into a very specific point in Reverse 1999 story. They're more general themes or general through lines that are just present throughout, right? And the first one we're going to take a look at is Miss New Babel. Now, Miss New Babel is clearly, evoking this idea of the Tower of Babel, right? The confusion of languages at Babel, in which man tried to build a tower to heaven, and as a result, God confused their languages, made them all speak different languages so that they were not able to coordinate with each other, and then they were scattered across the world. And this takes place in Genesis. Now, one thing that I want to impress about this story is that the construction of the Tower of Babel, right, happened just a few generations after the Great Flood. Like, this is maybe 1 or 2 generations, I believe, after the whole Noah incident, which means that God decided to wipe the earth, reset everything, and then not a few generations afterwards, man was like, you know what, we can take him. Let's go ahead and build a tower up to heaven and fight God. Like, that is the most undeserved confidence that anyone has ever had. That's it's kind of silly, right? And another point is that they started building the Tower of Babel on a plane, right? The ark landed on a mountain. They went down to the lowest, flattest point they could find and thought, you know what, this is a great place to start building a tower. But yeah, as far as the biblical context goes, that's what it is. Now, as far as Miss New Babel goes, I'm honestly a little bit annoyed with her, right? Because they gave her the name, they gave her the tower in her ultimate, and then they proceeded to do nothing with it. She doesn't, in her stories and in her bio, she doesn't really share any of these thematic components with the story itself. They just kind of slapped the name on her and then called it a day, which honestly, I'm kind of annoyed with it. I would have liked it if they had given her something more to tie into the biblical account, but what are you going to do? That's just how it is. So the next idea we're going to take a look at is the suitcase as Noah's Ark. Now, in the story, God tells Noah to create an ark because he's going to flood the earth. Man had become too sinful, and he just wanted a fresh start, a reset. And he tells Noah that he should take 2 of each animal into the ark so that once the waters do recede, he is able to repopulate the planet. And I think this point is a reference to how our arcanists, when they are in the ark, when they are in the suitcase, are seen in their Udima form. They are not people, they are animals. And this would also mean that the storm is the flood, right? It's this idea of wiping the slate clean so that a new era can take its place. But I don't think that is the only reference that the storm is making, because it also shares a lot of visual similarities to another biblical event, which would be the rapture. Now, the rapture is a fairly new addition to the Bible, relatively new. It appears in Thessalonians and in Matthew, which is part of the New Testament. Now, if you're not familiar with how the Bible works, you have the Old Testament, which was written decades, centuries before Jesus, like up to 700 BC, I believe. And then you have the New Testament, which was written after the fact, right? The account of the rapture is written, typically thought to be around 50 to 80 AD. So we're looking at several centuries worth of time here. In any case, the rapture is described as the second coming of Jesus Christ, in which all of the saved would be taken to heaven while the rest would remain on earth to await the end of days. And the typical depiction of the rapture is people vanishing, which would leave only their clothes behind. And we do see this in chapter 2, right? Once people start disappearing at the end of chapter 2, we only see their clothes. That's all that's left. Now, this does place Vertin in a bit of a weird spot, right? Because I don't think she's Noah. She's not necessarily only Noah, I should say. I think she is more playing just this role of a savior figure, because later on we'll see that she also plays the role of a Messiah, the Christ-like figure. Which is kind of strange, right? Because in the accounts of the rapture, it's supposed to be the Christ who comes to take people up to heaven. In this case, we are preventing people from being taken away by a storm. So I guess the concept itself is kind of reversed, but the theme is, I think, intact, which is neat. And now this last, general point, before we really get into the meat of things, is more a theory. It's more my own personal speculation, so definitely take this with a huge grain of salt, right? So later in the story, we get this idea that Arcana is kind of going to be our Lucifer figure, right? She is Satan. She is the adversary. And that Manus Vindictae are the forces of hell. And they do tie in a little bit more than just being the bad guys. We will get into that later. But if Arcana is supposed to be this idea of Lucifer, she embodies this role, then the one who would embody the role of her opposing figure, of Archangel Michael, who is classically said to be the one directly opposing Lucifer, would be Constantine, right? Because Archangel Michael is supposed to be the leader of the army of God. He is the leader of heaven's forces, right? He is supposed to be the one who cast Lucifer from heaven. He is supposed to be the one prophesied in Revelation to be the one to defeat Lucifer once and for all. And Constantine is, the leader of Foundation. She is the leader, de facto leader, right? Because there's still a president. But she is the de facto leader of the Foundation, of the forces opposing hell. Now, where we get into some really, really, crackpot theory here, right? The only one above Archangel Michael is God himself. In chapter 3, we see that Constantine answers to exactly one person, who is the president, which would make him, the God figure. Now, if Vertin is supposed to be our Christ figure, then that would imply that her father would be the God figure. She would be the president. Do I think this is likely? Do I think this is the case? Probably not. I just think the thematic ties are interesting. I don't think it's actually going to be the case in story. But as far as that is concerned, those are just going to be our more general points. We're going to go ahead and jump into chapter 2 for the more, specific points, the more direct allusions to biblical text. So the first really big event of chapter 2 is that Vertin and Schneider are captured by Manus Vindictae, and they are brought before Arcana, at which point Arcana subjects Vertin to an interrogation. She asks Vertin 3 questions, which is, why does the Foundation create the storm? What are the experiments that the Foundation is performing on children? And how are the arcana she has met thus far? And to all 3 points, Vertin basically rebukes her on all 3 points, right? She either does not answer, or she just straight up lies, or it is implied that she straight up lies. And I think that these 3 questions are actually a very good parallel to the idea of Jesus's 3 temptations on the Mount. So what happens in the biblical text, right, is that after being baptized, Jesus heads into the Judean desert to fast for 40 days and 40 nights. And after which he is approached by Satan, who then tempts him thrice. the adversary demands that he first makes bread from stone in order to sate his hunger, and this is seen as a physical temptation, temptation of the body. His second temptation is that Jesus jump from a great height, that the angels may save him and prove his power. And this is the emotional temptation. This is a temptation to prove your bloodline, to prove your devotion. And the third temptation is that he worship him in exchange for all of the kingdoms of the world. And this is the temptation of conquest, of control. And this really cements the fact that Arcana is going to be our, adversary to Burton, right? It's going to be Lucifer versus the Son of God, versus Jesus, basically. And this idea of 3 is a bit important because numbers in the Bible are a lot of the time symbolic. They're not literal, right? Because you see a lot of 3s and 1s and 7s and 12s, that sort of thing, and these all have specific symbology in the Bible. They mean certain things, right? For 3, typically it's this idea of a Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that sort of thing. And we will see it later on. But as far as the temptations go, I think Arcana's interrogation is actually a direct reference to that. Earlier, I kind of referenced this idea of Manus Vindictae as the forces of hell. And I think that this is kind of appropriate, more than them just being the bad guys. I think there is more to it than just that. Because the way Lucifer opts to operate in the text is that he's not necessarily a sower of destruction and misfortune and devastation. A lot of the times, the end result of his, machinations is that, but it's not the primary goal, right? His primary goal is to have people turn away from God. Because how it had originally happened, right? In the Garden of Eden, God had created man to have free will. He wanted to be a companion of man, and he wanted man to be able to choose. And instead, what man chose to do was to turn away from God. They chose to lie, they chose to sin, and were thus cast out of Eden. But the promise that they were made at that point was that if by the end of their lives that they had chosen to return to to turn back to God, to return to his embrace, they would be welcomed back into the fold and things would be as they had been before. And Satan's goal is to prevent this, right? Because he knows how everything is going to end. He knows Revelations, he knows the prophecies, right? He knows that in the end times, he is going to be defeated by Michael. There is no way he can win. What he can do is that he can take down as many people as he can with him. And the way he does that is through temptations, right? He offers people things that, maybe the forces of heaven aren't willing or able to offer, right? Because we have free will. We need to make these things for ourselves. And Satan basically gives them a shortcut to these things in exchange for their eternal soul, basically. And we kind of see this in the story as well, right? Not only through Arcana's temptations of Verton, but also through the temptations of Manus to just the common folk, right? Because we see in chapter 2 that they tempt the people with money. They tempt them with this idea of the stock market and being just wildly rich. They tempt them with parties and with extravagance and decadence. And then after that fact, once things start to really get bad, they tempt them with this idea of a false salvation. They tempt them with this idea of bringing them in so that they are not erased by the storm. And those that do fall to this temptation, we see, are eventually turned into monsters. They're eventually turned into the demons that follow the devil. So Manus Vindictae, I think, as the forces of hell, is a very, very appropriate way to kind of contextualize their role in the story. Following up this idea of the forces of hell and the Garden of Eden, we get this dynamic between Druvis and Forget-Me-Not, right? Because they are very reminiscent of this idea of Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Now, Forget-Me-Not is clearly the serpent, right? He's got the scales, he's got the fangs. In the Bible, the serpent is said to be enacting, like, the vessel through which Lucifer enacts his will, which is basically the role that Forget-Me-Not is playing in this era's storm, 1929. And additionally, he also kind of pays homage to non-biblical texts because his disposition, one of vanity, one of, jealousy, of envy, of anger, vitriol, all of this is kind of attributed to Milton's interpretation of the Bible, of the devil, rather. Because in Milton's work, Paradise Lost, he really gives Lucifer these very almost human-like qualities. This idea of just being jealous of mankind for still being in the good graces of God, and then seeks to destroy it. It's not specifically a biblical thing because honestly, Lucifer is not referenced a ton in the Bible. I believe the name Lucifer itself only ever really appears once as Lucifer the Morning Star at the very start. In any case, Forget-Me-Not is the serpent. Androvis is Eve, right? She has the garden, which would be her forest, and then she, for at least the first part of it, is living in blissful, almost ignorance. She chooses to separate herself from the world as a whole because she prefers the companionship of her trees. She wants to be separate from the evil and the sin of the world. But the moment that she's deceived by, the snake to turn to sin, she loses that opportunity, that privilege to be ignorant. She is now kind of inundated with all of these worldly sins, with all of these worldly desires, everything, and now she can no longer return to that forest. She even claims to Forget-Me-Not that the forest is no longer hers. She is effectively exiled, and then when the storm passes through 1929, she is literally exiled from her home, from where she had always known. What is probably the most recognizable biblical allusion in chapter 2 is, of course, going to be the Last Supper, right? And this is a reference to more Da Vinci's rendition of the Last Supper, but it did happen in a biblical context as well. Now, this idea of the Last Supper took place over Passover after Jesus's, triumphant entry into Jerusalem, and it happened the week before Good Friday when Jesus was crucified. Besides just the visual connections, there isn't too much here that'll really connect. Our major characters are sitting in the seats of disciples. Just going down the list, Sotheby is in the seat of James the Lesser, Carson is in the seat of Andrew, Marion is in the seat of Peter, Schneider is in the seat of Judas, Sinetto is in the seat of John, Verton is obviously Jesus, and Druvis is in the seat of James the Greater, X is in the seat of Matthew, Regulus is in the seat of Jude Thaddeus, and Apple is Simon the Zealot. For the most part, these are not too thematically important. I believe they were just placed there because, it kind of echoed Da Vinci's rendition, though some of them do have some significance, right? Schneider is in Judas's seat. Judas is the betrayer. He's the one who gave up Jesus to the Romans. He was the and in the end died because he was overcome with grief and chose to off himself. He's also the only one who actually kissed Jesus to, signify who Jesus was to the Romans. And this kind of fits Schneider because for the most part, she is playing an antagonistic role in the story to our main character. She does join up with us, but she is always kind of that outsider, the one who doesn't quite fit in with us. So her role is Judas, as the one who kind of doesn't really fit in with the rest of the disciples, makes sense. Sinetto is in the seat of John. John is kind of considered to be the disciple beloved by God, or by Jesus, right? He is said to be the one most loyal of them all, which it fits Sinetto to a T. She is loyalty incarnate, right? Verton is Jesus, makes sense. One of the disciples was actually not present at the Last Supper, and this was Paul. Now, Paul was interesting because before, converting to Christianity, he was actually one who prosecuted Christians. A lot of Christians' deaths could actually be attributed to Paul. And he actually made it a point to attempt to expunge Jesus and all of his apostles because he believed that they were a threat to Judaism. And I think, his role thematically could either belong to Lilia or Mesmer, because Paul was very much aligned with this idea of authority, of whatever power was in charge, which is something that Lilia and Mesmer both kind of embody. Now, Mesmer hasn't really had a redemption arc yet, right? She's still firmly on the Foundation side, but Lilia, I mean, she was aligned with Zeno, and then towards the end of chapter 4, we see that she actually busts in and kind of aligns herself with Vertin a little bit more. So I think that's an interesting point to make. The last major points that I really wanted to make were in reference to chapter 3 and chapter 4, with artificial somnambulism as well as Vertin's return to her crew. Now, I think artificial somnambulism kind of plays double duty here. The first of which, the first really significant thematic connection is through Jesus' anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, in the garden, and this is more chapter 3 sort of stuff, in the garden, Jesus kind of realizes he knows he's going to die, right? So he goes to the garden and he starts to beseech God, if possible, take this candle from me, take this burden from me, because I don't want to die, obviously. And he has his apostles come with him and hold vigil with him, to which, they fall asleep. In a sense, they are not able to be there for him, kind of like how Vertin's companions aren't really able to be there for her when she is being persecuted, right? Or, induced into this artificial somnambulism state. And additionally, the apostles, upon Jesus being kind of taken away, are willing to stand and fight for him, to which he tells them to stand down, which kind of mirrors how the Suitcase Squad holds just one entire section of the Foundation as hostage until their demands, for Vertin are met. And the Garden of Gethsemane is kind of seen as this moment of introspection for Jesus, as this moment of lamentation, of kind of not being super jazzed about his role in this story, his role of being the sacrificial lamb for humanity. And similarly, Vertin is kind of stuck in this kind of self-reflective state in somnambulism. She is forced to go back and look through her life as she had lived it, replay the memories of her youth, which are also a very tremendous sort of anguish and regret for her. And I think that makes a very neat parallel with how, with the Garden of Gethsemane. The second role that I think it plays is in the resurrection. Now, before I kind of stated this idea that the numbers are typically symbolic, right, in the Bible. Like, if you see the number 3, as I noted before, it is typically going to be significant. Jesus had died, and he was gone for 3 days. He had been dead for 3 days, and in that time it was said that he had traveled to basically the underworld to grant salvation to all the unbaptized souls, all of the souls that had never been a part of Christianity. He pulls them up and was their salvation, right? Before returning 3 days later, and then ascending to heaven. Vertin kind of plays this role as well, right? Because in artificial somnambulism, it's kind of an afterlife sort of parallel, I guess you could say, because one of the portions is called limbo. Limbo is where all of these pagan unbaptized souls are kept in like the classical interpretation. So this idea of Vertin in a dream going down to what is basically the afterlife to interact with these souls and to help them with whatever it is that they are having issues with, of resolving their conflicts, I think is a very neat parallel to this idea of Jesus dying, going down, and then coming back up after 3 days, or in Vertin's case, after 3 months, and being reunited with her apostles. But as far as the video goes, I think that's a very good place to leave it, right? These are basically the really major points that I was able to kind of suss out from what we've been given so far. Now, I am very interested to see where we go from here, because at the time of this recording, right, chapter 1.3, update 1.3 rather, is set to come out in about a week, something like that. And I am very curious to see if they're going to start to incorporate more of the Southeast Asian mythology, you know, Hinduism, that sort of thing. At least with shamane, right? We see some very direct references to shamanism and this more traditional cultural approach to spirituality. And I think it'd be very interesting if they start to incorporate a lot of that as well. But yeah, that's basically the video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope it wasn't too drawn out, you know. And if you did enjoy, go ahead and maybe just leave me a like, maybe sub a little bit, you know. Feed the algorithm a little bit, maybe, right? But that's it. Thank you for watching. I will see you later. Bye-bye.